Hey you, welcome back. There are two types of intelligence. We all know this. We just overlook one way too often. There is the emotional intelligence that we understand somewhere around our heart, the center of our chest. There's also the intellectual intelligence of our brains. It really wasn't until Descartes that rationalism took such a hold on primarily Western culture, Western Europe, and its offspring. And in much of the rest of the world, it was really the emotional intelligence that was primary for the early Christian community in the Greek world. The goal of prayer and worship was to take the rational intelligence and to be able to seat it within the intelligence of the heart, or the wisdom of the heart, the way of seeing the world through that emotionally intelligent lens. So we, in the West, after Descartes, the age of reason mutated into something unsustainable, quite frankly, putting primacy of logic, science, and math, and that sort of reason above all else. A new innovation, new way of thinking. So to the earliest Christian communities, there wasn't that duality. For the Greeks, there was also sort of a duality of the concept of time. We're all familiar with the concept of chronos, linear time. There's also kairos, or present. When is it ever not the present? Zeno's paradoxes. The Greeks had a way of thinking of eternity that didn't involve that linear push towards eternity as some arrow of time consistently going forward forever and ever. They instead had a concept of eternity where the arrow from the bow to the target would have to cross the halfway point. But in order to get to that halfway point, it would also have to cross the halfway point. In order to get to that halfway point, it would have to cross the halfway point. Smaller perspectives. So Kairos time is the present that always is. The present that has always been. The present that always will be. So the early Christian communities attempted to set up a model of time that I also believe the Jewish community attempted to convey to their lineage and their people. For them, the rite of Passover, sacrifice to the temple, annual pilgrimage, the annual rites that occurred, attempt to give to their heart eternal present and that connectivity with their lineage all the way back to their patriarchs. The early Christians wanted the same thing to happen in their worship services, which they modeled after the Jewish synagogue. Come together as a people, understand the wisdom presented from the writings, while the instructor, the priest in the case of the Christians, or the Pharisee in the case of the synagogue, would expand on those scriptures. But there was a continuity of people. There was a continuity of that sacrifice. There was a continuity of that lesson, always representing the one and eternal gathering of the people into something greater, a greater organism, a multicellular organism, the slime mold of Christianity. Pretty good metaphor, I'll get to that later. We also should get back to the pre-rational idea of the symbol. The etymology of symbol is sin, to bring together, bolo, the hunting tool, the two rocks on a string that you throw it at your prey and trip them up and all that. So symbolo is to bring together two realities. So symbols themselves for us right now are illustrative symbols. What they really convey is an absence of the real thing. If I look at a picture of a guitar, that is a picture of a guitar. It is not the guitar. It tells me of a guitar. Platonic form sort of gets into this a little bit, tapped into the idea of the guitar in order to create a different type of guitar. In a concept of kairos, ever present, symbols attempt to convey to the mind through the heart of the participant the bringing together of the realities. And it doesn't matter how distanced those realities are along the the idea of chronos, if the symbol itself is proper, true to its form, accompanied with the mental image of what it is representing, it becomes a substitute that you can then participate with through your senses. And that is what these early liturgies that we have passed down to us attempted to do. For instance, a priest in preparing the bread. I didn't know this until I went to Afghanistan, and I was so bored that I figured I'd kick back. I couldn't go to liturgy unless I was in Kandahar. The Romanians actually had an Orthodox church in their camp, so I could go to liturgy if I was in Kandahar, but most of the time I was in Tarankot or flying around hanging out with some Green Berets in their safe houses, so I didn't get to participate in liturgy. I would instead have to substitute by listening to the liturgy and reading along. It worked occasionally. You ever go to church in a Black Hawk? That's an interesting thing you can't hear. Anyway, so in the order of preparation for the Divine Liturgy, every piece of clothing has a very rich symbol from Old Testament events. When he first puts on, the priest is dressed in all black, and he first puts on the main portion. My soul shall rejoice in the Lord, for he hath clothed me in the garment of salvation. With a robe of gladness he hath encompassed me. As a bridegroom he hath set a crown upon me, and as a bride hath adorned me with ornament. Puts on his stole. Blessed is God, who poured out his grace upon his priests, his ointment upon the head, which runneth down upon the beard of Aaron, which runneth down the hem of his garment. So the stole itself, symbol of the oil, is used to symbolize further Christos, the Christ, the anointed. Blessed is God, who girded me with strength, and he puts on his belt. The cuff. Thy right hand, O Lord, is glorified in strength. That's so common throughout all of the Old Testament. I counted just the other day, and there's 38 references within the Psalms themselves to the right hand of God. The right hand was the symbol of power. See, it's symbol upon symbol upon symbol. We've lost that. He then puts on the outer covering. Thy priests shall clothe me themselves with righteousness. When it comes specifically to preparing the holy bread, he uses a spear. Speaks about remembering, bringing to mind Lord and God, Savior Jesus Christ, as a spotless lamb is dumb before his shearer, so opened he not his mouth. In his humiliation his judgment was taken away. And for this generation who shall declare it? For his life was taken away from the earth. And each one of those statements, he's cutting around a seal that has Jesu Christos. Sacrificed as the Lamb of God. One of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side, and immediately they came forth blood and water. At that point, he's mixing wine and water into the cup. These sorts of repetitive but essential statements are to allow the priest in his intelligence of the heart to enter into a kairos. It's a meditative exercise. We in the West are so familiar with mindfulness being some sort of Far Eastern practice that was brought to us. Mindfulness is really just getting behind chronological time of Descartes. Words and actions and symbols can become so much more to our own heart. We can enter into a state of mind where we are no longer bound by the chronology of this being a spear in 2020. No, it is the spear of the soldier as it pierces the side of Christ and brings forth water and blood. Because that is what all of those symbols acting together are happening for the priest right there in his heart. So that's the preparation. Then you get into the service itself. Greeks had in mind the polis, simply the place where the populace come together. The marketplace, the city. The city itself was a center of influence, people coming together. Every polis had a hierarchy of power. Greek city would be contained within a city-state, which was contained within a confederacy of city-states. Reflecting on that, the prayers that are offered at the very beginning kind of go from top to bottom. Praying for the holy house, praying for the whole peace of the whole world, salvation of all, praying for the archbishop, going down the line hierarchically, and then the civil authorities, praying for the president, praying for the armed forces everywhere to keep us safe. These all have very rich traditions where 1700 years ago when this liturgy was written, you desperately needed to pray for your soldiers in your city-states because you didn't know when the barbarians were going to come and just destroy your livelihood. The world was a little bit more chaotic place, perhaps. But the idea of just offering prayer for the stability of your polis was very important, and so it was incorporated at the very beginning. And then healthful seasons, travelers by land, by sea, and by air, deliverance from all tribulation. The supplications themselves kind of go down the line to the smaller unit, if that makes sense. And so this was offered from the very beginning not only to provide stability from the forces of nature or barbarians, whatever chaos would come to the polis. It's also a way of bringing to the mind of every participant the same. The wisdom of their heart really finds peace in the idea that divinity is protecting them. Science lends itself to believe that maybe there's something to that. The earliest of peoples have always attempted to meditate, to pray, to ask for the blessings. And the more in tune, the more harmonious they could become through these lengthy prayers. The group comes together to pray for stability within the polis, within the church, within the hierarchy of their government, while at the same time preparing themselves to be at peace, present, kairos, being attuned to the present moment. In the tradition, want to get the senses as involved as possible. It just assists in the same goal of bringing our entire reality into this chirological time in which we are connected only to a body of believers that extends back 2,000 years. And so we have incense taken from the Old Testament as a representation of prayer, visually and olfactorily. Smell. We have icons that at one point were argued over with regards to heresies. St. Gregory Palamas primarily was that we don't worship the wood or the paint. We are worshiping again the symbol, the bringing together of the reality. This is all we can do to have a representation of Christ or John the Baptist or the Theotokos, the God-bearer, the Virgin Mary. And so that's the best we've got. That's the best we can do. So we're going to put them here so that we can see it. We can participate it with our senses. We can hear the Byzantine chant coming from the choir who represent the angels. We can taste the body and blood of Christ. We can kiss the icons. All these things are meant to bring our body and the wisdom of our heart to such a place where it pierces through that logical reason that we live our lives by, kind of on autopilot, brings us into this peaceful, meditative beta theta wavelength before us, while also serving as a reminder that it's all just one reality happening chirologically. So you have the choir beginning right away, O Son of God, who art risen from the dead, save us who sing unto thee, Alleluia. And from there the choir more specifically represents the cherubim, as they state, while the priest himself brings to the people the Gospels, an icon that can be opened and can be read and can be relived for the teaching earliest times, most of the churches were house churches, or most of the very earliest temples, modeled after the synagogue, were a place of worship. The place of preparation was in a different building. And so these things would have to be brought out of the different building before the people. And so we have an iconostasis, a wall of icons, and we have doors. So the priest does bring out of one door the lessons, while the choir itself sings the words, Isaiah's visions of the angels, and Isaiah saying that I'm not worthy, and the angel bring a coal to his lips so that he could be made clean. That is a type. In the Greek concept of mind, there was a type, which was literally a type, like we consider typeset, the way things are set up. It's a type, the fulfillment of which would model that type. And so Christ as the fulfillment of the type set forth in what was expected of a Messiah, according to Isaiah primarily. In the Old Testament, you'd have representation of the angelic choirs, lessons presented to you by the epistles, the gospel, the readings of the life of Christ. You'd have a short sermon, and then you'd kick out the catechumens. Early Christianity very quickly became known as a mystery religion, a mystery cult, much like the cults in the Greeks of Dionysius or some of the other mystery cults that were out there. The catechumens were kicked out. The reason for that was that they had not been instructed long enough and been able to pray long enough, fully recognize what was about to happen after the sermon. The attempt to be the most holy aspect of the service. The angelic choir sings the hymn of the cherubim, specifically from Isaiah. The priest prepares himself, a lengthy prayer, Psalm 50, incensing the entirety of the church, bringing holiness to the smells of the people, bringing holiness upon the icons themselves. Just a visual and an olfactory representation of the prayers of people going back from the very beginning, who prayed to the universe for protection or for blessings or any of that, but specifically the Jewish tradition that the Christians inherited and took upon their own. They didn't see themselves as any different. The Messiah was to be a light to lighten the Gentiles. The way in which Isaiah is interpreted by Paul primarily and by the Christian community is that the true manifestation of the Messiah was not to be some sort of earthly political individual to overthrow Roman rule the way in which the Maccabean revolt worked only a couple of hundred years before the Romans came and destroyed the temple. The proof of the Messiah was that Gentiles would be bound and gaffed to the vine of Israel, that the nations would come together. And so that is where choir, the angelic choir, sort of starts to get us in the mood to watch this, while the priest takes what he had already prepared and finishes the preparation by meditating, reading Psalm 50 to himself, really trying to get in that mood. I don't know how anyone can honestly do it, but the responsibility. And so then is what's called the great entrance. You have some of the younger children holding candles or icons of the cherubim in this procession from the place of preparation through the faithful up through the center to the holy doors. Living icon of Christ's holy entry into Jerusalem, the procession through the streets. And so you'll see the faithful reach out to touch the hem of the garment of the priest, not because they believe that the priest is Christ, but because it allows them to reenact this sinful woman with blood. It's a beautiful parable. So a woman with an issue of blood in Jewish culture knows that there'd have to be a period of cleanliness afterwards. So in that parable, Jesus is on his way to meet with a Pharisee. Jesus is on his way to meet with the leader of a temple, of a synagogue. And there was a woman who had an issue with blood that just had faith that somehow she could just simply touch him, that she could be made well. And so she touched him. And it's very easy for us to dismiss that, that woman, wow, she was just crazy. Why would you think that? But hey, the miracle worked. Cool, that's awesome. But I think we miss the point of that story when we tamper that down. A woman had to overcome her own fear of passing along to Jesus uncleanliness when he was about to go and meet a Pharisee. A woman knew that in touching Jesus, Jesus would have to ritually cleanse himself for 14 days before he would be able to actually meet with a Pharisee again. And so you can imagine the horror. She's trying to sneak sort of this touch, like, if I just touch him, maybe I'll be healed. He won't even notice. He can go on about his way. So you can imagine the absolute spiritual horror that happened when Jesus, we're told in the Gospels, felt the power go out of him, or looks around and asks, who touched me? And the apostles are like, dude, you're in the middle of a crowd. Like, who hasn't touched you? Everybody's bumping into you, And just that moment of fear. And so that's what we, I think, if we're in our right mind in the worship service, that's what we're attempting to really bring ourselves to just, again, just a little reminder, just a little action that I can do to remind my very stubborn soul and my very stubborn heart that I'm completely unworthy and I'm about to be given the very essence and energies of God in communion, despite as unworthy as I am. So the procession ends, and the altar itself becomes the type of every altar going back to Abraham, Christ, and Isaac. Isaac being the type of sacrifice that Kierkegaard mentions in Fear and Trembling, that level of faith that is beyond comprehension, that if anybody would have stopped Abraham at the time, especially his wife, he had to journey for 3 days with his son asking questions, with his only son, who God had promised to him was going to be the way in which he could populate the earth. And now all of a sudden God's asking of him to sacrifice Isaac. Doesn't make any rational sense whatsoever, but Abraham is a man of faith. Does it. Can you imagine 3 days? I don't even have children. I've never loved anyone as much as a father would love his child begotten in old age. 3 days of a journey with every intent to kill your son because God asks you to. I read Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling while I was acclimating in Iraq back in 2004, September or so, first week and a half. That was kind of the start of all this bibliophilia, really. And I think Kierkegaard does a very excellent job of really laying out just that short little story that we get. So these types within the Old Testament are being fulfilled before our very eyes while the choir sings in Byzantine chant the reminder that they are representative of the angelic choirs. And we, as the laity, as the gathered together people, are praying for the world, for all the structure of authority around us. And we have physical cues to bring all of this into our reality of now. If we just get rid of the logical mind that's chronological, especially. If we just allow ourselves to be swept up emotionally in the wisdom of the heart, in what we witness, what we've read, what we know, what we have memorized to have happened chronologically 2,020 years ago, and allow ourselves through Kairos time, the symbolic bringing together of that reality back then, and the reality is happening right in front of us and has happened every 8th day since that time among the nations and among this body of believers. There's been times when I've been praying and I've just been participating in the liturgy, and I can just close my eyes, and behind me I can feel thousands of years of thousands of people who are right there with me, who have done the exact same thing. That's what church is supposed to be all